Steve, maybe just a quick reminder on the Q&A.
Right. So the Q&A, as with the previous two sessions, the chat function is disabled for participants in the webinar format. So we have a live Q&A, and that's where you can post questions, and we have the team here who will try to answer as many of those as we can back into that Q&A box as we go along. And some of the questions will also be addressed by the speakers and part of the discussion.
All right, should we go ahead and get started?
Sure.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ramdeen. I'm a data curator for SESAR, the System for Earth Sample Registration, and along with my coworker, Lucia Profeta, we're going to be giving you an overview of SESAR and EarthChem today. Specifically, our services are designed for supporting data and metadata related to samples. To start, here is the agenda for today's session. We'll start off with an overview of data and sample management services offered by SESAR and EarthChem, and then we'll stop to take questions about the two systems. Then we'll present the application of the Tephra community best practices in both SESAR and EarthChem, and we'll give you a brief introduction to each before moving into a live demo. For the SESAR demo, you'll be able to follow along in creating an account. And after the demos are done, we'll have another break where we'll provide space for questions and discussion. And then we'll close the session out with time to talk about how to provide feedback and also next steps for this collaboration. As we heard in session one, there are many reasons and motivations for sample and data management within the Tephra community and within the scientific community at large. And instead of going into detail, I just want to highlight a few high-level concepts. This includes, you might have requirements for a data management plan from your funding agency. It might be a requirement from your publisher in order to submit a journal article. You might want to be able to support fair samples and data. And finally, you might want to be part of the broader open science ecosystem. And I'm sure there are many more, but these are just some key reasons for why you might want to conduct data sample and data management. So we here at EarthChem and SESAR are an NSF-funded project, which are designed to support sample discovery and management, the publication of data as well as its preservation, and to support data mining and analysis. This is done through our core system operations, our review and creation of user-submitted data, and the aggregation and ingestion of published data sets. And this is what you're seeing in this top row. These services, though, are built on the foundation of best practices and standards from the geochemical and samples communities. As such, we here at SESAR and EarthChem, we conduct community engagement and collaborations, such as this project with the Tephra community. We also participate in a number of international initiatives for research data management, and we'll mention some of these collaborations in later slides. We're active in such communities as ESIP, the Earth Science Information Partners, the Research Data Alliance, and the Global Geochemistry Community through One Geochemistry. We're also connected to more specific projects and tools like StravaSpot, which was highlighted in the last session, and other tools like Sparrow and others that we'll talk about later on. So we offer services related to sample discovery and management through SESAR, and through EarthChem, we offer data publication and preservation, as well as services which support data mining and analysis. And now we're going to go through each of these systems in more detail. Let's take a closer look at sample discovery management here at SESAR. So what is SESAR? SESAR is a community platform that helps make samples more discoverable, accessible, and reusable. They also connect samples with the knowledge ecosystem derived from them. So SESAR offers a wide range of services to support scientists during the life cycle of samples. We provide a dashboard to support metadata management, user support and curatorial review of metadata, a public catalog for user-contributed sample metadata to support discovery and access, and IGSN registration to support unique identification and tracking of samples as they move from the field to the lab to publication. So SESAR also provides a number of services that address, again, that concept of fair and fair samples. As I mentioned, we provide quality control of metadata through both automated validations and curatorial review. We support external links to publications, data, and more. We have an embargo period that allows you to make your data inaccessible while you're working on publication. Following the NSF guidelines, it is a limit of 2 years. We support metadata profiles, which are tailored and appropriate to sample discovery, as opposed to, say, another identifier like a DOI, which is more tailored towards publication. And these metadata profiles also capture provenance information. We issue globally unique persistent identifiers, the IGSN, as part of the sample management for proper citation. And then we also support sustainable access to metadata through our catalog and our web-based protocols. For example, if you had a system, you could harvest our metadata using OMI PH. Sorry, I'm probably getting the acronym wrong, but we have methods for that. So users manage their sample metadata in our dashboard called MySESAR. MySESAR is a private working space which allows users to register sample metadata, either in bulk or individual samples, and then this is how you access your IGSNs once issued. Within MySESAR, you can view it and edit your sample metadata. We also have a number of tools that support metadata management, such as a tool that allows you to add images and files to your records. Features will let you manage permissions so that you can give someone else access to edit your sample metadata, perhaps if you're in a lab where you're sharing resources. And also processes for transferring samples, perhaps if you're donating or putting your materials into a repository or other collection. We also have a tool that allows you to do label printing for samples, and that label includes a QR code embedded into it, which when you scan will lead you to the metadata profile for the sample. So this diagram shows an overview of the SESAR submission process. First, the user prepares the file according to our guidelines, which we'll demo later in the session, and you would use the appropriate template for your community. Then you would submit the file through MySESAR. It then undergoes 2 quality checks. The first is a validation on submission, and this is just an automated process that checks for things like, are you using the right controlled vocabularies for this particular metadata field? Are you putting letters in a field that only requires numbers, and so on. If it passes that check, it then gets sent to the curator for review, and the curator checks the batch for completeness and compliance. And this might be, is the sample type appropriate for the metadata and samples that you're submitting? And other checks like that. Did you include recommended fields? Are things mapped to the right place? If it passes the second review, it's then processed and the IGSNs are applied, and then the completed submission is sent back to the user. If it fails at any of these checks, this curator will send the submission back to the user with questions and recommendations on how to correct the submission. And the purpose for collecting all of this metadata is then to make it discoverable and accessible. And we do that through our public catalog, which allows researchers to find existing samples that may be relevant to their research. Users can search the catalog using geospatial information, by sample type, by sample classification, and other criteria. From the search results, you can then view the results on a map, you can download the results, and you can also view the individual sample metadata profiles. And here's an example of one of the profiles on the right. So in addition to this metadata registration, we also issue IGSNs. So as part of this, you're getting a landing page or metadata profile about the sample, and the IGSN is what's called resolvable, like a DOI, where it will lead you to the landing page where you can find out more information about the sample. This page might include images, like you can see here at the top. It might include other associated files and then metadata about the sample itself. So when the sample is registered with SESAR, we issue the IGSN, and then we as SESAR maintain these landing pages over time, but you as the user maintains the content of this page. So you can update things as you gain more scientific knowledge, or again, if the sample is transferred to another lab, or to add perhaps the DOI for a published data set about the sample itself and other things. And this is a good opportunity then to say, well, what is an IGSN? Well, again, IGSN is a globally unique persistent identifier for samples. It's an international best practice. It's mostly used to help solve issues with ambiguity. So for example, I go out and collect samples and I name the first one IC1 because I'm on an expedition to Iceland. So, but how can I tell the difference between my IC1 and someone else's IC1? And that's where the role of a persistent identifier comes in. It helps you uniquely identify the sample from another sample that might have a similar naming conventions, but that metadata makes it unique and is attached again to the sample itself. IGSNs are issued for samples taken from the natural environment. This includes rocks, specimens, water samples, cores, but they're also given to sampling features, so sites and stations and stratigraphic sections. If you have any questions about the IGSN, it's a little bit out of scope here, and I think we might have mentioned it briefly in session 1, but I'm happy to answer questions later about that. But IGSN, the purpose behind them is that they help fill in this graph of connecting samples to the broader environment, because that ID can now be included in a data set submission. It can be connected back to the researcher. It can also include links back to the cruise program or event that funded it and different things. And so it allows you to locate, access, link, and cite the samples effectively. And that is the introduction to SESAR. And now I'm going to pass it over to Lucy to present on EarthChem.
Thank you, Sarah. So we at EarthChem have 2 main branches of support for researchers. The first is data publication and preservation that we do for files contributed to the EarthChem library. And the second is data mining and analysis, where you can access data through multiple databases and portals that we will go into later. Next slide, please. So the EarthChem library is a repository for data files. It offers quality controls for metadata and data. We support data publication and registration with digital object identifiers, DOIs, and we commit to long-term archiving for these files. We offer a choice of different open licenses so that you can decide what will be done with the content of the files that you're sharing. And we also offer data embargo. As Sarah had mentioned for SESAR, it is a period of up to 2 years based on NSF recommendations. You can also take advantage of links to different external resources. Next slide. Such as adding your funding sources. For the National Science Foundation, for example, you can add directly what your project number is, and you will have that information available for your DOI and easily accessible. Or next slide. You can link your sample IGSNs, which will then have all of the metadata for your samples be associated with the dataset that you submitted. And next slide. The submission and curation process entails that when you are ready to submit your data, we offer various guidelines and templates, as well as different policies that will ensure that your data is shared according to FAIR principles and that your sample information is easily accessible. Once you complete these data templates, you can then use our online form to submit them. And from there, a data curator will be in touch with whether or not we require any additional information. Some of the checks that we do are technical. We don't peer review the data, but we do make sure that the formatting is correct, that all of the required fields are filled out, and recommend whatever would be necessary to make this as reusable for end users. Once all of the checks are passed, we then ingest the files into the repository, and you can get your full citation with the DOI that can then be used to fulfill data management plans or to add to a journal publication. And some example of submission guidelines, next slide, can be found on our website, where we go into specifics of what kind of file types we accept and what recommendations we have for different types of licenses, and a lot of useful information that will help you complete the submission. Next. We also adhere to policies in line with the FAIR and trust principles, and you can find all of this information also on the website under policies. And finally, we offer a variety of data templates. We will go into more detail later on the templates that were specifically designated for the Tephra community. Next slide. The best practices that went into creating the data templates were never made in a vacuum. And we are always looking towards the community to make sure that we are aligning with whatever is recommended for current data standards. And with that in mind, we joined the One Geochemistry Initiative, which is a global movement for creating best practices and standards for geochemical data. You can also be involved in the One Geochemistry Initiative if you're interested, and we'll drop a link in the chat for that later. And we have a Slack channel for One Geochemistry where you can stay active and know about our future events. Next slide. So aside from contributing data, you can access data through EarthChem. And here is an overview of the different portals where you can mine data and analyze it. Next slide. One portal that might be of interest to the Tephra community is the Decade portal. It is a discovery tool which aggregates data from multiple databases, and they are all linked through volcano IDs from the Smithsonian's Global Volcanism Program. It's currently being expanded into the volcano portal with help from the Converse project. And the new functionality will add open topography, LiDAR data, and information from IRIS and UNAVCO on different seismic events. So when you go to the Decade portal, you can look for a specific volcano and you will get results that are available for that volcano from multiple data sets, including through the EarthChem portal, which we'll talk about in a minute, and from SESAR and other sources. Next. Another database that is accessible through EarthChem is PetDB, the petrological database, where you can have aggregated searches across multiple published data. And you can also access precompiled expert data sets. We track our sample data across multiple publications, which makes it an integrated way to access this data. Here you can see a search for Tephra data from the East African Rift. A lot of this data was compiled with the help of a project that is currently ongoing with, excuse me. I'm sorry. So East African Tephra data from the RFD project. And as you can see, you can use this to help you either download all of the data or making multiple selections on the same interactive map. Next slide. We are in the process of redoing our interface at the moment, and we are also providing new APIs that will make the process more seamless for integrating data into Jupyter notebooks or any type of machine learning applications. So this will streamline data analysis projects. Next slide. If you're looking to query data across multiple databases, one resource can be the EarthChem portal, where you can retrieve data from sources such as NavDat or GeoRock and integrate them with data from the USGS or from PetDB. You can both download these data files, or you can create interactive plots and visualizations. Next slide. All of these tools are part of a larger vision where we are trying to work with partners across multiple data systems to make sure that there is an integration between what happens to your data from the moment you collect it in the field throughout any type of analyses that you do in the lab, and then make sure that it is shared in a fair way. So these data the sample metadata would be readily accessible for the lab data management system, and then multiple APIs would help integrate this across the different projects. Unfortunately, these connections are not yet built, but we are working together to make this as seamless for researchers as possible. And this is also being facilitated by our work through One Geochemistry. I'd like to take this moment to also let you know that some upcoming events for One Geochemistry are being held at EGU, the European Geoscience meeting in May. And if you are attending, please come to our session, Making Geoanalytical Data Fair, Managing Data from Field to Laboratory to Archive to Publication. And I think with that, we can open it up for questions.
There we go. Took a moment to figure out how to unmute myself. So far we had gotten some questions about whether or not SESAR has incorporated the margins database into the system. That I'm not sure about. I've answered this in the chat, but I'll answer it here again. I'm not sure about that, and I can look into it. But I do want to emphasize one point is that SESAR is it's for submitting samples, but we try to recommend that the owner of the sample submits the metadata, and that's where some questions can arise, because we don't want to end up with people duplicating data that already exists, and also there's a little bit of decision and ownership of the sample too, and updating the metadata. So we encourage the owner of the sample to register them themselves, and then if they do end up transferring them to a repository or other scientists, that they then transfer the metadata files as well, which we do support in SESAR. So I'm not familiar with margins, as I mentioned, so it's possible we haven't ingested their material because they might not be the owners of it per se. And it is worth looking into, though, if we haven't, how we might connect and build that relationship. And there's another open question that Lucy's answering right now about is the entire PetDB, sorry, it moved over to the answered questions. Is the entire PetDB database discoverable when searching through the EarthChem portal? And Lucy replied, yes, the content sync the PetDB every 3 months. Let's see, there's another open question. So this is a database for rocks, but also for instances of water compensations of volcanic lake, volcanic gas, and seawater data. Yes, we support physical objects in the earth sciences. So if that happens to be a water sample, a soil sample, it is acceptable. We do encourage you, though, if you look and see that our controlled vocabularies don't exactly fit your needs, that you contact us, because we are flexible in adding new terms to our controlled vocabularies, or we might recommend another organization to use. So to clarify, SESAR is an allocating agent for the IGSN organization, which issues IGSNs. We are the USA-based allocating agent and open to the public globally. But there may be another allocating agent that might be more specific to your community. And so we might point you towards them instead. But more than likely, we'll work with you to add the terms needed to support your materials into our system. We've got another question. How would the integration with StravaSpot work? It seems like there might be some overlap in the functionality in these portals and will lead to duplication of workloads, registering samples and uploading metadata. Lucy shared that slide earlier, and actually, can I go back to it? There we go. That's actually something we'd like to work on to prevent such duplication. As Doug mentioned last week, we're looking at a process that will allow you to mint your IGSN within Strabo Spot so that you can submit the metadata through that method and not have to do it a second time or replicate the effort. That is a planned tool, though, that isn't developed yet, and we're hoping to work that out in the future. But that is something we take into mind and is in consideration, and that's partially why we developed the Tephra templates for SESAR the way we did, and I'll get into that a little bit during the demo. Let's see, we've got another question about EarthChem. I've been having an issue with logging into EarthChem using ORCID. It says on the loading screen, it stays on the loading screen, does not move forward, it just stays frozen. Natasha, if you could email us at, Lucia confirm it's info@earthchem.org. Yeah, we can get in touch with you and troubleshoot a little bit more if it might be your browser or some other issue, and we can talk to the developers about it if it's a recurring bug. And that's the same for any of our systems. If ever you have a problem, feel free to reach out. We'll share these in the chat, but they're also on the slides. Our email addresses are info@geosamples.org and info@earthchem.org. And as curators, we respond to those questions. We're open to things like, how do I use your system, help with bugs and other errors, and any other questions you might have about the services. Okay, so we're doing good on time. Does anyone have any other questions? All right, I was doing that teacher thing where you purposely pause really long and hope someone feels the courage to ask their question. And I'm drawing it out a little bit in case anyone's typing. But if not, we'll move on to the next half of the presentation. And let me close this Q&A thing so I can see the slides, sorry. So returning to the diagram we shared at the beginning of the session, we mentioned that best practices and standards are the foundation for both EarthChem and SESAR. And as part of that, we've been working with the Tephra community to better support the Tephra best practices within our systems. There we go. On the next few slides, we'll introduce you to the EarthChem Tephra community and show you how the best practices guidelines have been incorporated into our systems. So EarthChem and SESAR recognize that different user communities have different needs. And as such, we offer users a platform through EarthChem to host community recommendations for our services built around the specific data types or scientific themes for their community. And so our goals with these communities is to support the development and to promote best practices, which will enhance access to data for a specific research community. The Tephra community is one of our most in-depth spaces, and we're really proud of this work, and I hope you take some time to look at this space. We've worked closely with the Tephra community to present a recommended workflow for how to use our systems and tools that leverages our services for the specific needs of this community. So from this work, we've created a data submission workflow that will address the process and recommendations for submitting methods, samples, and analytical data to EarthChem and SESAR for registration and preservation. By following this workflow, you'll expedite your submission process within our services. For the EarthChem, data curation, publishing, and DOI timelines may take up to 2 weeks per submission, depending on the completeness of the metadata and also just the complexity of it. SESAR's timeline is typically shorter, but it depends on, again, the complexity of your submission, which we'll address a bit in the demo. And we're going to take things a bit out of order to simplify, and we're going to start with SESAR first and then move on to methods and analytical data in EarthChem. Though I will note, though, we will check in on time and we might skip that depending on how things are going. Okay, so focusing on SESAR. In SESAR, users typically create their own templates through a tool that we host in MySESAR that lets you select the appropriate metadata fields from our list of about, I think it's 78 metadata fields that are supported. But for the Tephra community, we needed to do something a bit different. So in this section of the workshop, we're going to give you a brief overview of how these templates were created for the Tephra community to provide some context. And then I'll move into some demos to show you how to use SESAR, create an account, and then submit metadata for registration. So the work started with the best practices guidelines for the Tephra collections, which contains the specific guidelines for samples. This set of recommendations can be downloaded on Zenodo. Steve highlighted them again at the beginning of this session. And the particular file that you want to look for is called the Tephra Collections Best Practice Guidelines. From a broader perspective, the guidelines contains recommendations for how to gather Tephra sample data and what information to capture about them in order to support increased usability and scientific collaboration, as well as sample reuse. The guidelines in particular contain information about stations or sites, cores, core drivers, sections or runs, different names, different uses, and individual samples. And I've highlighted those here on the slide, but they're not highlighted in the file itself. So on the left here is an example of what one of the guidelines looks like once you open it up. It's got the category of the term that you might, metadata field you might capture, a definition or the Tephra examples, and then some additional references and resources. This particular example is from a core driver. On the right is an example of a SESAR template. And as you can see, they don't really format well. They're not really the same structure and things. And SESAR has a very specific structure requirement for submissions. So the guidelines don't conform to that structure. And so we had to work a bit to create a method for the Tephra specific templates to ingest them into SESAR. And I'm just going to take a second to show this quickly. I'm not going to go into detail, but I wanted to show you the SESAR database schema to show you that SESAR stores data in tables in a relational database. And this is why our ingestion process needs to be structured in a very specific way. And because of this, this is also how we support the discoverability and access. So it's not just free text or large scale files, where we actually have these tables that can be indexed and pulled up in our catalog search. In addition to the structure, we had to think about mapping of the content from the best practices to our SESAR metadata fields, because sometimes the field names are not exactly the same. And for some fields in SESAR, we have controlled vocabularies. And so this is where, when I mentioned during the question and answers, we're willing to accommodate and able to accommodate new terms as needed by the scientific community. So while it's obvious to users what the matches might be, though, it's not always obvious to the machine. So we actually had to go through this process of matching, well, this field is the same thing as this field. And we worked together to create this recommended mapping of the most accurate and relevant SESAR fields. And as you can see on the right, again, they're not always the exact match, but we have things like it's project lead in the Tephra best practices. We've got collector chief scientist in SESAR. Start time at station, collection time. So sometimes they're pretty obvious, sometimes there are slight variations. And we'll take a look at this a bit more once we get into the templates themselves. One of the important features of the templates is that, and SESAR, is that we support hierarchical relationships between samples. So this is typically referred to as like a parent-child relationship. And for the Tephra community, that means you can register a site, then you can register the samples that were collected at that site as a child of that parent. And then that relationship will be transparent on the metadata profile for the sample. And if you follow the example on the slide here, it will resolve to an example IGSN that has that. It is a site, it's got a bunch of cores, it's got some siblings related to it and subsamples from it as well. For the Tephra community, the relationships we support are sites, cores, core sections or core drivers, and individual samples. So the diagram on the right, we can see some of these imagined relationships. A site can have cores collected at it. You could also collect an individual sample at a site. A core can have a core driver or section sampled from it, and then you can sample an individual sample from that as well, and so on. And note in this diagram, those are fake IGSNs. They will not resolve. The example at the bottom, as I mentioned, will show you an actual live example where you can better understand how these relationships are represented. So when developing the Tephra specific templates for SESAR, we respected the idea that some groups will have different workflows. They might not be able to capture all of the recommended metadata. And as such, we developed two different templates. There's the comprehensive and the simplified. Each template, when downloaded from the EarthChem site, will include a README file, the relevant templates, and the SESAR quick guide. So not all the fields in the templates are required in either of the templates, and those fields that are not mapped to SESAR, which are included in the comprehensive template, will still be ingested into EarthChem if you submit that. So there's some slight differences between the two. And let's get into a little bit of how to pick the right template for you. So again, when deciding which to pick, you should focus on the practical versus ideal. Filling out the comprehensive one would be optimal and trying to capture everything that someone might be looking for to reuse your data. But we understand that we don't always have all of these things, and it can be hard to capture this stuff if it's not built into the start of the project. The templates are not intended to be a holdup to the registration process. We don't want you to, we don't know what your field project is like. And so we provided some different options again to allow you to fill out this information as you can. The goal is to make it discoverable. And you can do that using either method, the comprehensive or the simplified. The simplified just has the minimum in it. But filling out the comprehensive will make things more discoverable, and it will include some information that's not just about the samples. And as we'll note later, not everything in the comprehensive template is mapped or ingested into SESAR, but it will be included when you submit this into EarthChem. And I feel like I've said this multiple times already, but again, don't want to stress that doing the minimum is a big step forward. So there's no requirement to use the comprehensive templates. It's just about getting stuff into more standard shared formats and also supporting the ingestion into SESAR. So the comprehensive templates, again, is optimal method for the Tephra best practices guidelines. It automatically converts what you submit into that format, and I'll show you this during the demo of the Tephra best practices into SESAR specific templates, and it supports the 4 different sample types in one submission. Now, this is different from the simplified, which it's a variation on the traditional SESAR template. It contains all of the mapped best practices specific metadata that are available in SESAR, and that is it, just the ones that are in SESAR and not the additional fields. And it includes 4 files, 1 for each of the sample types. So there's 1 for sites, 1 for cores, core drivers, and individual samples, and you would fill out each one individually. And I just want to do a time check. Let's see, just to figure out how in depth I'm going to get. I think we're doing fine on time. So now during the demo, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going to go through account creation, and then we're going to go through batch template registration. First by showing you how to complete the simplified and the comprehensive, and then also how to upload them. And actually, I'm going to probably do those in the reverse order. Focus on the comprehensive first because it's most complex and takes the most time. And then we'll do the simplified, and then I'll show you how to submit them. And then if we have time after showing you how the registration process, I'll show you a little bit of how to search through the system and managing your metadata over time. So now if you want to follow along with account creation, you would go to app.geosamples.org/index.php, or you can just go to geosamples.org and click on the My SESAR button in the top right corner to log in. I'm also going to share with you the link to our sandbox or test environment. That's cesar.dev.geosamples.org/index.php. You'd have to create another account there as well. We periodically sync the two, but again, it's a few months in between. So if you create an account in one, we might not have synced the two yet to have the account show up on the dev in the sandbox. But the sandbox would be a place that would allow you to play around with the process and test out registering a sample without actually issuing an IGSN to them. You'll be given like a placeholder that looks like an IGSN, but it won't be registered with the IGSN central registry, and it will not resolve. But it will allow you to play around with the SESAR tools without actually having to put live data into the database. And so we'll also provide demo files after the workshop. So I'm going to get out of the slides. Okay, are you seeing, just to check, are you seeing an Excel, or sorry, a Windows folder?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so I wanted to start off first. Actually, no, I'm skipping a step. I want to go into actually creating an account. So ignore that. But if you go to SESAR, as I mentioned, in the top corner is this My SESAR button, and it will take you into our application. For this demo, I'm going to start with on our sandbox site. So I've sort of skipped that step, but after you click on My SESAR, it'll lead you to the screen where you'll determine how you log in. We support 2 different account types. The recommended account type is an ORCID, but we understand not everyone has ORCIDs or can use ORCIDs, and so we also have another system called GeoPass. Today, I'm just going to focus on creating an account through ORCID. If you have questions about creating a GeoPass account, again, feel free to email us, info@geosamples.org. So I'm going to click login with my ORCID, and it should take me to the ORCID screen to log in. And during this process, you might be asked to add SESAR as a trusted agent. It's not doing it for this because I've already authorized SESAR in a previous attempt. But that's just saying it's allowing SESAR to pull your public information like your name and your email account. And that's how it's pre-populating some of these fields here with your ORCID and your name. But after you get that, it'll bring you back here to SESAR, where you'll see a slight variation on the screen. But I already have an account. And so it's triggering me to say, are you sure you want to create another account? We have 3 other accounts associated with this, or sorry, 2 other accounts associated with this name. But you won't see that. You should see instead just these yellow messages saying there's some required steps you have to complete before you can move forward. And so to complete our account, we're going to add our institution and then our email address. And then we also have to, oh, it already populated. We have to add our country. And so you'll want to update your profile, and that should then create your account. And as you can see now at this point, it's removed those error messages. Your next step in being able to use SESAR is to create a user code. So from here, SESAR user codes are a 5-character prefix onto your IGSNs that start with IE, which stands for AIDA, our parent organization, and then a 3-digit code of your choice that represents you as a user. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on how to pick a user code, but I recommend you read our resources for researchers on our website, or resources for institutions, depending on where you're located, because you might create, for example, a user code for you as a scientist, or you might create one for a project, or you might create one for your repository. And there's different practices and recommendations on what your needs are. After you create the user code in the same space, you can then authorize someone else to use your user code. And that's why I say to read those recommendations and find out what works best for you. If you're working on a team, you might have the lead chief scientist might create a user code and then share it with all the students or other PIs on the account. And there's different best practices based on how you'll be using your account. At this point, I'm going to switch over to our test system where I already have a user code created, just so I don't create conflicts in the sandbox. So let me switch over to this. To get back to where I was, in case you needed to, that's in the My Account tab here at the top. So I'll just click on it just for show. You can see I'm in our test, which is our internal test environment, slightly different than the sandbox. And you can see I've got 2 existing user codes, and I can manage my permissions. I can set which one I want to give somebody access to based on either their GeoPass ID or their ORCID. But once you're logged in and you've created an account, you'll traditionally be brought to the My homepage once you log in. This provides you access to a few key areas. This includes a space to register and update samples. You can look at what samples you already have registered, and you can transfer ownership of samples and other administrative tasks. So just take a quick peek. So here I can see all the samples that I have registered in SESAR. I can filter them using a few different tools. The user code, the date which they're registered. I can download the samples. I can also print labels for them, as we mentioned earlier in the demo. And one of the main things here too is that you can edit the metadata records of the files. And through the edit process, you can also upload files or add URLs to a sample. The main area we're going to focus on today, and if we have time, I'll come back to the other sections, is registering a sample. SESAR has 3 methods for sample registration. We have an interface where you can register 1 sample at a time. It's time consuming, so usually this would be if you have a small set of samples, you would go through our GUI interface and walk through the steps to register a sample. The method we'll focus on today is the batch registration. We have tools here for you to create your own batch file, but we're going to skip that step because we have batch files that are templates that are created specifically for the Tephra community. And then in addition to that, in the same area, you can update your sample metadata, and we'll come back to that again too if we have time. Let's see. If you need help with any of these systems, again, you can email us, or we have tutorials on our website. So now I'm going to take a moment now and show you the templates. First, I want to start with, sorry, wrong file. This was the Tephra best practices for collections. And as you can see, we've got a number of tabs. There's an introduction document and a number of tabs. And again, the way that it's structured is very specific. And this wasn't the right method to be able to ingest it into SESAR. So we had to do some work to it. And so what we created were these comprehensive templates, which look slightly different, but contain a lot of, if you look at the bottom here, we have a lot of those same tabs, like A for project. But we can see here, the materials are slightly different formatted. What we've done is we've transposed the fields. So instead of being rows, they're now columns, right? Sorry, that threw me off for a second. I think I said that right. But we've transposed the data. So now instead it's structured in the way that SESAR reads things, which is by row at a, or sorry, column at a time. But we've contained a lot of the same information. So there's that category first of what the metadata field is. Then you've got the definitions and examples for the Tephra best practice. We've also then included what the SESAR definition is for that field and what the field name is in SESAR to help you understand better that mapping. And then an example of what an entry looks like. And below that is then space where you would enter your metadata. I feel like I probably should have taken a step back to get the template, you would download them from the EarthChem Tephra community. And when you download it, it's a zip file. It contains 3 items. That template that we're looking at now, the SESAR quick guide, and also a README file. A lot of what I've been saying here right now is in our README file. So it's understandable that there's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts. You might not be able to take notes. And of course, you'll be able to view the recording later, but you can also refer back to these README instructions that will go over a lot of this in more depth. Okay. Okay, back to the submission. So as we see, we've got these fields at the bottom here that are the same as in the best practices recommendations. Again, they're just transposed format for SESAR. What we did in the creation of these templates was then also added, sorry, I'm going to move the Zoom tools out of the way. We added a few other tabs, and if you scroll through them, you'll see them. They're labeled with SESAR at the start. And so what this is doing is there's formulas embedded into each of these entries where you're putting in the data, where it's automatically then transferring it into the appropriate field in the appropriate tab for SESAR. So here, if we look at the subject, or sorry, the field itself, it says sample name, it's got a name listed, but it's pulling it from the station tab B, and then a particular row that maps to this field. And so that's why when we talk about the comprehensive and this process, is we're really trying to support you filling out the Tephra best practices guidelines and using that as a guide, and then automating that process to get it into SESAR with minimal work for you. And I will note here that we're having some issues. There was an update with Excel and it's messed up some of the formulas. So for now, we'll get to this when the submission process, but for now, some things are not working as expected, and we'll let you know when that's been resolved. But again, there's different tabs for each of the sample types in SESAR, and it's pre-filling information about them, as you can see here. If we wanted to, we could probably change something in one of these fields. Sorry, Steve, I'm going to delete your email address and write something else. Oops, I can't type my own name right now, don't mind me. And that should update now into the fields where that cell is. So let's go back to this is our site. We'll scroll over. And it should have replaced, yeah, you can see it's replaced Steve's email address now with mine. So that's how the templates work, is that, and the instructions, the README instructions will go over this, is that you'll want to fill out the lowercase lettered tabs for the appropriate samples that you're collecting and registering. And then it will pre-fill the SESAR tabs with the appropriate information. Now, there's a little bit more information in how this gets then processed for ingestion into SESAR. There are a few required fields that you have to fill out. For example, we require an object code. For in this one, it's Steve's, it's BOF, mine is IE-SER. So I would have to add this information. It doesn't automatically get added to these fields. Or maybe it is pulling it from the project. Sorry, I was wrong about that. It is automatically pulling it. But there are any fields that are in bold in here are required, and you'll have to fill them in. So when filling in these different lettered tabs, you can skip any that are not bolded. And let's see. So once you've completed the Tephra templates, you should take the opportunity to then go ahead and double check that things are mapping properly on a basic level into the SESAR tabs. And then you'll want to delete any of these empty rows at the bottom where there's zeros. This is just because we've set the formulas down for so many different fields and it's ingesting null values. And if you have trouble with that, again, just feel free to reach out to us. And that README does have more instructions. And so you would just delete those because otherwise you'd be attempting to register null values into SESAR. So for the process of the demo, let's go back to SESAR. I'm going to go through a few different uploads. First, I want to show you what registering a file looks like when it fails the upload. So let's see. We're in the, hopefully I didn't go too fast with that. We're in the register and upload space. I clicked on upload a new batch template, and now it's asking me for which file. I'm going to navigate to it through my browser. So, sorry, the Zoom things are over all my materials. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and upload, let's see, a file that Steve had sent us earlier. And this is going to fail. And that's not because he did anything wrong. This goes back to my point earlier where I talked about some of the formulas have gotten changed in an updated version of Excel. But so I click upload and it's thinking about it. It's reading the file. And this is where, as we talked about in the beginning, we're doing a number of validation checks. So it's looking and it's saying, hey, there's some problems here. What should be a date isn't really looking like a date, and other similar messages. And it will highlight the field where that problem is. In this case, the 0 is because we didn't delete the empty cells where no data was captured. But you can also see it's doing some other weird stuff because of the formulas. But otherwise, the system will tell you where there are errors, and it will highlight them and tell you an information about why it is an error in this top section above. And at this point, it will prevent you from uploading the file because of the errors. So you'll have to clean this up. And if you need help with that process, again, feel free to reach out. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to add another file, but now it's going to be one that's clean and hopefully going to pass through the validation checks. There we go. So I'm going to upload this. And see, now we don't get those red lines and the scary red messages at the top. Before you hit submit, you'll want to scroll through and check and make sure everything looks right. Because even though, again, it's checking for things like, this is a latitude. Is it really a latitude? Is it less than 90 degrees? Is it a number? You might notice that it's perhaps got some of the text fields off a bit. And so you might want to just do a quick scan of this. But the curators will do that as well. And once you feel comfortable with how the submission looks, you'll click on register now. And you should see this confirmation message. At that point, that's where, when we talked about, it's handed over to the SESAR curator for review. And we'll do that more in-depth search again, where we check to make sure, is this really the right sample type? Is this metadata complete? And perhaps then recommendations back to you before processing the submission. All right, so that was the process for registering one of the comprehensive samples templates. I want to take an opportunity now and show you what one of the simplified templates looks like. So when you download the simplified template, you get a lot more files. So you get the README document, again, tailored for the simplified templates. You'll get the SESAR quick guide, which we should probably take a quick look at that. It's mostly the same information that you're seeing in the comprehensive template. Here at the beginning, where we've got the SESAR definition explanation, it's very similar to that, but instead it's just a list of all the SESAR metadata fields. So for example, if you have some other samples you want to register that aren't Tephra materials, you might take a look at this and get some ideas of what metadata fields are possible. Again, it includes an example, a definition, and then links to any controlled vocabularies that exist. Okay, so again, comprehensive README, but then there are individual files for each sample type. And as I mentioned before, they're hierarchical. So you'll want to register the sites first before you register any children, because then you'll be able to put the IGSN for the parent into the record for the child. So let's take a look at an example of the simplified. So the simplified has two tabs, the SESAR tab, and then also you have the mapping and definitions, and it's similar to what we've got in the other one, where you've got, here are the metadata fields for SESAR, here's what it is in Tephra, and some examples. I forgot to mention this with a comprehensive, but when you save the file, you need to note two things. You want to keep it open to the tab that you're submitting. So with a comprehensive file, you'll want to save it on SESAR site as the parent when you submit that. And for the simplified ones, you'll want to save it on the SESAR tab. That way, when the My SESAR dashboard ingests the file, it looks at what the current active tab is. And that way it will ingest the metadata from the appropriate template and not from the README part of it, right? And you'll also, the second point is that these file types are an older version of Excel, Excel 97 through 2003. You want to leave it in that format and not update it. If you update the file, SESAR won't be able to ingest it. Okay. So then with the simplified templates, you can see it's just text. There's not any formulas. It's not pre-populating information. You'll have to manually enter all that information in. And again, it just contains the fields that are mapping from the Tephra best practices to SESAR, which is unlike the comprehensive, which has a bunch of other fields that might not map. Oh, sorry, this is not the right. Some other fields included in here and other information like stratum and intervals, which are not being mapped into SESAR. So to submit our simplified template, again, you'll want to save it on the open tab so that it knows which one is active and what you're registering. And then you'll want to do the same thing to upload a new batch registration file. You'll add the file. And again, we'll go through that same validation process. This one will pass, there's no errors, it's identifying things. We'll just do a brief check on it to make sure it looks right. And then we'll click the same button again, register now, in confirmation message. Let's see, let me do a time check. We're an hour in. I think we're fine. If anyone wants to, I can probably take a few questions about this process, or I can also show you a few other features of how SESAR works. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a second so I can look over at the Q&A and see what's come up. Okay, so let's see. The first question, do all of the ODP, IODP samples have IGSNs as in the example site you gave us? Or is the IGSN determined only if someone did an extra analysis on the sample? That was a project when SESAR first started to ingest those as a collection. I think hopefully I'm getting that one right, Lucy. It was a few million samples ingested at that time. I'm not sure if they're still actively issuing them or just giving out those that they've already assigned. So that's a good question. Again, I can look into that and check our system to see when they last registered samples to see if they're doing that on analysis. Let's see, someone asked, is the site defined by a specific GPS coordinate or can it be an area? That's a good question. You don't have to include latitude and longitude. We support some experimental samples that are developed in the lab. You might be pre-registering samples before going out in the field for collection. So we don't require latitude and longitude. And then we also have a number of other metadata fields like locality description, address, and other things that will allow you to capture the location in a different method. Okay. Is there a way to read in the correct sheet names SESAR site? Seems like saving it with it open is a bit funky recipe for issues. Well, yes, but this was the workaround that we could come up with to do this. And that's why perhaps instead you might use one of the simplified templates because it's a lot more straightforward, or create your own. Unfortunately, there's, as I mentioned, we're using an ingestion tool that's looking at a file from 2003 or earlier. So we're a little dated on that, and it's not supporting something as modern as what you're asking about. But perhaps that's something we might do in our next development phase. We're working on a new backend for SESAR to issue out in the next 2 years. And so this is something we'll take away from this comment to include that in maybe our designs. Let's see, someone asked, maybe I missed this, but are you allowed to skip fields in the comprehensive file? And what is the real use or need for the simplified one? You can absolutely skip fields in the comprehensive file. The only ones required are in bold. And for SESAR specifically, we only require the sample name and the user code and the object type. So very minimal metadata. But there's the encouragement that if you use the comprehensive file, you're going to be able to capture a lot more richer information than what SESAR supports. And when you ingest it into EarthChem, you can put that whole file in there as well for someone else to access. The reason for having the simplified ones is look at it, like the question said before, it's a little funky and it's a recipe, right? Problem for some people. It might be easier and more approachable as a first step to use the simplified templates. It's going to contain all the key information that you want to register for your samples and also to make them discoverable for Tephra. And it might be a more approachable way of getting into the system.